Robinson Crusoe, Chapter 1, My First Sea Journey. Before I tell my story, I would like to tell you a little about myself. I was born in 1631 in the city of York in the north of England. My father was German, yet he came to live and work in England. Just after that, he married my mother, who was English. Her family name was Robinson. Therefore, when I was born, they called me Robinson after her. My father was successful in his business and I went to a good school. He wanted me to get a good job and live a peaceful life. But I refused that. I wanted an adventurous and exciting life. I want to be a sailor and go to sea, I told my mother and father. They were rather unhappy about it. Please don't go, my father told me. You will be sad. You know, you will be sad. Sailors have a hard and dangerous life. And because I loved him and he was unhappy, I tried to forget about the sea. But I couldn't forget, and about a year later, I met a friend in town. His father had a ship, and my friend told me, "We are sailing to London tomorrow. Why don't you come with us?" And then, on September 1, 1651, I went to Hull, and the next day we sailed for London. But after a few days, there was a strong wind. The sea was rough and dangerous, so the ship went up and down. I was very sick and afraid. "Oh, I don't want to die," I exclaimed. "If I live, I will go home and never return to sea again." The next day the wind dropped, and the sea was quiet and lovely again. "Well, Bob," my friend smiled, "how are you now? The wind wasn't so bad?" "What?" I shouted. "It was an awful storm." "Oh, that wasn't a storm," my friend replied. "Only a little wind." "Forget the wind. Let's have a drink." After a few drinks with my friends, I got better. I forgot about the danger and decided not to return home. I didn't want my friends and family to make fun of me. I stayed in London for a while, but I still wanted to go to sea. So, when the captain of a ship asked me to go with him to Guinea in Africa, I said yes, and then I went to sea for the second time. It was a good ship, and everything went well in the beginning, but I was so ill again. Then, when we were near to Canary Island, a Turkish pirate ship followed us. They were well-known thieves of the sea at that time. There was long, hard struggle, but when it finished, we and the ship were prisoners. The Turkish captain and his men took us to Salé in Morocco. There, they wanted to sell us as slaves in the markets, but finally the Turkish captain decided to keep me for himself and took me home with him. This was a sudden and horrible change in my life. I was no longer free, and this Turkish captain was my master. Chapter 2. Down the Coast of Africa. For 2 long years I lived like a slave. I worked in the house and the garden, and every day I planned to run away. But it was never possible. I thought about it all day long. My master liked to go fishing in a little boat, and he took me with him all the time. A man called Molly and a young boy went with us too. One day my master told us, "Some of my friends want to go fishing tomorrow. Prepare the boat." So we put plenty of food and drink on the boat, and the next morning we waited for my master and his friends. But when my master arrived, there was nobody with him. "My friend don't want to go fishing today," he said to me. "But you go with Molly and the boy, and catch some fish for our dinner tonight." "Yes, master," I replied quietly, but inside I was excited. Maybe now I can escape, I thought. After my master went back to his friends, we took the boat out to sea. For a time we fished silently, and then I moved careful behind Molly and knocked him into the water. "Swim to the shore," I shouted. My master loved to shoot seabirds, and so there were guns on the boat. Promptly I took one of these guns. Molly was swimming after the boat, and I cried, "Return to the shore. You can swim to the shore. It's not too far. I don't want to hurt you, but if you come near the boat, I will shoot you through the head." So Molly turned and swam back to the shore as quickly as possible. Then I said to the boy, "Zorie, if you help me, I shall be a good friend to you. If you don't help me, I will push you into the sea as well." But Zorie was glad to help me. "I will go all over the world with you," he shouted. I wanted to sail to the Canary Island, yet I was afraid to go too far from the shore. It was just a small boat, and so we sailed on the south for a few days. We had very little water, and it was a dangerous country here with lots of wild animals. We were scared, but we often had to go on the shore to get more water. Once I used a gun and shot a wild animal. I don't know what animal it was, but it made a delicious meal. For almost 12 days we sailed on south, down the coast of Africa. Then one day we saw some people on the shore, wild people who did not look friendly. By now we had very little food, and we needed help for real. We were frightened, but we had to go on the shore. At first they were afraid of us as well. Maybe white people never visited this coast. We did not speak their language, naturally, so we used our hands and faces to show that we were hungry. They came with food for us, but then they moved away immediately. We carried the food to our boat, while they watched us. I wanted to thank them, but I had nothing to give them. And then 2 big wildcats came down to the shore from the mountains. I think those animals were leopards. The people were afraid of the wildcats, and the woman cried out. Promptly I took a gun and shot one of the animals. The second one ran back up into the mountains. Guns were new to these African people, so they were afraid of the loud noise and the smoke. But they were pleased with the dead wildcat. I gave them the meat of the dead animal, so they gave us more food and water. We now had lots of food and water, and we sailed on. After 11 days, we came near the Cape Verde Islands. We could see them, but we couldn't get near since there was no wind. We kept waiting. All of a sudden, Zorie called to me, "Look, a ship!" That was right. We called and cried and sailed our little boat as fast as we could. But the ship did not notice us. Then I remembered the guns that made a lot of smoke. After a few minutes, the ship saw us and turned. After we got on the ship, the Portuguese captain listened to my story. He was going to Brazil and agreed to help me, but he didn't want anything for his help. "No," he replied when I tried to pay him. "Maybe one day, someday will help me when I need it." But he gave me money for my boat and for Zorie as well. In the beginning, I did not want to sell Zorie as a slave, after all our dangerous adventures together. But Zorie was glad to go to the captain, and the captain was a good man. "In 10 years' time," he said, "Zorie can be set free." When we arrived in Brazil 3 weeks later, I said goodbye to the captain and Zorie, left the ship, and went to start a new life. Chapter 3: The Storm and the Shipwreck. I stayed in Brazil and worked hard for a few days. By then I was wealthy, but bored too. One day some friends came to me and said, "We are going to Africa for business. Come with us. We will all be rich, thanks to this journey." How silly I was. I had an easy, comfortable life in Brazil. Yet, of course I agreed, and so, in 1659, I returned to sea again. In the beginning, all went well, but then there was a horrible storm. For 12 days it had been rainy and windy. We lost 3 men in the sea, and before long, the ship had holes in its sides. "We are all going to die this time," I thought. Then, one morning, one of the sailors saw land. Yet in the next minute our ship hit some sand just under the sea. The ship could not move, and it was really dangerous now. The sea was trying to break the ship into pieces, and there was very little time left. Immediately we put a boat in the sea and got off the ship, but the sea was rather rough, and our little boat could not live for long in that wild water. Half an hour later the furious sea turned our boat over, and we were all in the water. I searched round for my friends, but I could see no one. I was isolated. That day I was fortunate, and the sea carried me to the shore. I could not see the land, just the mountains of water all around me. Then, all of a sudden, I felt the ground under my feet. Another mountain of water came pushing me up the beach, and I fell on the wet sand. At first, I was very grateful to be alive. Slowly, I stood up and went higher up the shore. From there, I stared out to sea. I could see our ship, but it was wrecked, and there was no one near it. There was no one in the water, too. All my friends were dead. I was alive, but in a strange, wild country, with no food, no water, and no gun. It became dark now, and I was tired. I was too scared to sleep on the shore. Maybe there were wild animals there. Thus, I went up into a tree and stayed there all night. Chapter 4: A New Life on an Island. When they came, the sea was silent again. I looked for our ship and, to my surprise, it was still there and still in one piece. "I think I can swim to it," I said to myself. So I walked down to see, and soon I was at the ship and was swimming around it. But how could I get onto the ship? Finally, I got in through a hole in the side, but it wasn't easy. There was so much water in the ship, but the sand under the sea was still holding the ship in one place. The back of the ship was high out of the water, and I was very grateful for this, because all the ship's food was there. I was very hungry, so I started to eat something at once. Then I made up my mind to make some of it back to the shore with me. But how could I reach there? I looked around the ship, and after a few minutes I found some long pieces of food. Having tied them together with rope, I got the things that I wanted from the ship. There was a large box of food, rice and salted meat, and hard ship's bread. I also took a lot of strong knives and other tools, the ship's sails and ropes, paper, pens, books, and 7 guns. Now I needed a small sail from the ship, and then I was ready. Slowly and carefully I returned to the shore. It was hard to stop my things from falling into the sea, but in the end I got everything onto the shore. Now I needed somewhere to keep my things. There were a few hills around me, so I decided to build myself a little house on one of them. After I walked to the top of the highest hill and looked down, I was very sad, because I saw then that I was on an island. There were two smaller islands a few miles away, and after that just the sea. Only the sea, for mile after mile. After some time I found a little cave in the side of a hill. In front of the cave there was a good place to make a home. So I used the ship's sails, rope and pieces of wood, and after so much hard work I had a very fine tent. The cave at the back of my tent was such a good place to keep my food that I called it my kitchen. That night I went to bed in my new home. The next day I thought about the possible dangers on my island. Were there wild animals? And maybe wild people too. I didn't know, but I was so afraid. So I decided to build a quite strong fence. I cut down young trees and put them in the ground, in a half circle around the front of my tent. I used many of the ship's ropes too, and at last my fence was strong as a stone wall. No one could get over it, through it, or around it. Making tents and building fences is not easy. I needed lots of tools to help me. So I decided to go back to the ship again and bring some more things. I went back 12 times, but soon after my 12th visit, there was another awful storm. The next morning, when I looked out to sea, the ship had disappeared. When I saw that, I was very sad. Why do I still live, and why are all my friends dead? I asked myself. What will happen to me now, alone on this island with no friends? How can I ever run away from it? Then I told myself that I was fortunate to be alive, fortunate to have food and tools, fortunate to be young and strong. But I knew that the island was somewhere off the coast of South Africa, and the ships did not frequently come down this coast. And I thought, I'm going to be on this island for a long time. Thus, on a long piece of wood, I cut these words. I came here on 30th September 1659. Then I decided to make a cut for each day. Chapter 5. Learning to live alone. I still needed my things. Well, I thought I'm going to have to make them. Therefore, I worked every day. Above all, I wanted to make my cave bigger. I carried out stone from the cave, and because of many days' hard work, I had a large cave in the side of the hill. Later, I needed a table and a chair, and that was my next job. I had to work on them for such a long time. I wanted to make places to put all my food and all my tools and guns too. But whenever I wanted a piece of food, I had to cut down a tree. It was long, slow, difficult work. And during the next months, I learned to be extremely clever with my tools. I wasn't in a hurry. Time was infinite for me. I also went out every day, and I had my gun with me all the time. At times, I killed a wild animal, and then I had meat to eat. But when it became dark, I had to go to bed because I had no light. I couldn't read or write, since I couldn't see. For a long time, I didn't know what to do. Yet at last, I learned how to use the fat of the dead animals to make a light. The weather on my island was generally very hot, and there were often storms and heavy rain. The next June it rained all the time, and I couldn't go out so often. I was also ill for a few weeks, but slowly I became better. When I was stronger, I started to go out again. The first time I killed a wild animal, and then the second time I caught a big turtle. I had been on the island for 10 months before I visited other parts of it. During these months, I worked so much on my cave, my house, and my fence. Now I was ready to discover more about the rest of the island. First, I walked along the side of a small river. There I found open ground with no trees. Later, I saw some more trees with lots of different fruits. I decided to take the fruit and to put it to dry in the sun for a time. Then I could keep it for a lot of months. That night I went to sleep in a tree for the second time, and the next day I went on with the journey. Before long I came to an opening in the hills. In front of me everything was green and full of flowers. There were many different birds and animals. I noticed that my house was on the worst side of the island, but I didn't want to move anywhere, for it was my home now. After I stayed away for 3 days, I came home, but I often went back to the other, greener side of the island. This was how my life went on. Every month I learned to do or to make something new. But I had troubles and accidents as well. Once there was an awful storm with very heavy rain. The roof of my cave fell in and almost killed me. I had to build it up again with lots of pieces of food. I had so much food now. I cooked my food over a fire or dried it in the sun. So I always had meat during the rainy months, if I could not go out with a gun. I learned to make pots for my food, but I wanted very much to make a harder, stronger pot, a pot which would not break in a fire. I tried lots of time, but I could not do it. Then one day I was lucky enough to make some new pots and put them in a very hot fire. They changed color, yet did not break. I left them there for lots of hours, and when they were cold again, I found that they were hard and strong. That night I was very pleased to have hot water for the first time on the island. By then I had my own bread too. It was also luck. One day I saw a little bag. We used that bag on the ship to keep the chickens' food in. There was still some of the food in it, and I dropped some of it onto the ground. After a month, I saw something bright green there, and 6 months later, I had a very small field of corn. Maybe now I could make my own bread. It was easy to say, but it was difficult to do it. It is such a lot of work to make bread from corn. A lot of people eat bread, but how many people can take corn from a field and make bread out of it without help? I had to learn and make lots of new things, and it was a year before I cooked and ate my first bread. During all this time, I always thought about escape. When I traveled across to the other side of the island, I could see the other islands, and I thought, maybe I can get there with a boat. Maybe I can get back to England one day. So I made up my mind to make myself a boat. I cut down a big tree, and then I started to make a long hole in it. It was hard work, but 6 months later, I had a very good canoe, and then I had to get it down to the sea. How silly I was. Why didn't I think before I started work? Surely the canoe was too heavy. It didn't move. I pulled and pushed and tried everything, yet it did not move. I was very upset for a long time after that. When that happened, it was my 4th year on the island. In my 6th year, I made myself a smaller canoe, but I did not try to run away in it. The boat was too small for such a long journey, and I did not want to die at sea. The island was my home now, not my prison, and I was just glad to be alive. About 2 years later, I made myself a second canoe on the other side of the island. I built myself a second house there too, and so I had 2 homes. My life was still busy all day long. I had always things to do or make. I learned to make new clothes from myself from the furs of dead animals. It is true that they looked rather strange, but they kept me dry in the rain. I kept food and tools at both my houses, and wild goats too. There were lots of goats on the island, and I made fields with high fence to keep them in. They learned to make food from me. Before long I had goat's milk to drink. I worked hard in my cornfields too, so many years passed. Chapter 6. A Footprint. Then, one year, something weird and terrible happened. I frequently walked along the shore, and one day I saw something in the sand. That was a footprint, the footprint of a human. I looked everywhere, but there was no one. That night I could not sleep, and the next day I got all my guns ready. Before I put more wood and young trees around my house. Although nobody could see me now, I was afraid and did not leave my cave for 3 days. Finally, I had to go out to milk my goats, but for 2 years I was scared. One day, after a year, I was over on the west side of the island. From there I could see the other islands. I could also see a boat which was far out to sea. If you have a boat, I said to myself, it is easy to sail across the island. Maybe that explains the footprint. It was a visitor from one of the other islands. I started to move more freely around the island again, and built myself a 3rd house that was a very secret place in a cave. Then one year, when I was again on the west side of the island, I saw something that made me feel ill. I saw heads, arms, feet, and other pieces of man's body everywhere. At times there were fights between the wild men on the other islands, so they came here to my island with their prisoners to kill, cook, and eat them. Slowly I went home, but I was very furious. How could someone do this? Later, one morning in my 23rd year on the island, I was out in my fields and I saw the smoke from a fire. 9 men around the fire were cooking their terrible food, and then these wild men danced round the fire, singing and shouting. This continued for about 2 hours, and they got into their boats and sailed away. The next time they come, I'm going to kill them, I said furiously. Chapter 7. Man Friday. For 2 years I felt lonely and scared. One night there was a terrible storm, and I thought the sound of guns out at sea. The next morning, when I looked out, I saw a ship which was lying on its side not far away from the shore. After I put my little boat in the water, I sailed out to it. There were 2 dead men on the ship, yet nobody alive. The others were lost in the sea. I took a few clothes and tools, and also a box of Spanish gold and silver money. I was a rich man now, whereas I could buy nothing with it. I needed somebody to talk to, somebody who could help me escape from the island, so I decided to try to catch a prisoner, but for a year and a half I saw no boats. Then one day there were 5 boats. There were nearly 30 men, and they had 2 prisoners. They killed one of the men and started to cook their terrible meal. While the second prisoner waited under the trees, all of a sudden he turned and ran. Before long he was coming near the bottom of my hill. Quickly I ran down the hill and jumped out the trees between the prisoner and 2 wild men. I hit the first man with the wooden end of my gun, and he fell down. Yet I had to shoot the second man. The poor prisoner was too frightened to move. I wanted to show him that I was friendly, so slowly he moved closer to me, but just afterwards, the first prisoner started to get up from the ground. Then, after the prisoner talked, I understood that he wanted my sword. I gave him the sword and he immediately cut off the head of his enemy. After we hid the dead bodies under the leaves, we left quickly. I took him to my secret cave and gave him food and drink. The prisoner was a fine young man, about 25 years old, tall and well built, with a kind face and a nice smile. He had a brown skin, dark hair, bright eyes, and strong white teeth. I decided to give him the name of Man Friday, as I first saw him on a Friday. I started to teach him to speak English. How pleasing it was to hear a man's voice again. Friday was a quick learner of English, and his English became better day by day. He helped me with the goats and with the work in the cornfields, and shortly we were good friends. I liked teaching him and having a friend to talk to. It was the happiest of all my years on the island. Friday and I lived together merrily for 3 years. One day, when we were at the top of the highest hill on the island, suddenly Friday started to jump up and down, very excited. "Look, master, look!" he cried. "My country is over there." I started to think again about escape. I took Friday to the other side of the island before I showed him my big canoe, which still lay under the trees. "Can a boat like this sail to your country, Friday?" I asked him. "Oh yes," he replied. When I said that we could do another canoe like that and he could go home in it, Friday looked very sad. He said, "You must come with me. Kill me if you like, but don't send me away from you." Then I understood that Friday was a true friend, and so I agreed to go with him. For the canoe, Friday chose the tree himself. He understood wood better than I did, and we cut it down. We worked so hard that the boat was finished in a month. After 2 weeks, it was in the sea, and we started to get ready for our long journey. Chapter 8. Escape from the Island. It was now my 27th year on the island, and I did not want to be there for another year. We were going to take lots of food with us. One evening, Friday went out to search for a turtle for meat and eggs, but in less than an hour he was back and he looked very scared. "Master, master," he shouted, "there is a big ship near the island, and men are coming to the shore in a boat." To my surprise, I noticed that it was an English ship. Why was the ship here? Maybe they were pirates. "Don't let them see you, Friday," I said. "We will hide and watch." There were 11 men on the boat, yet 3 of them were prisoners. Their arms were tied with rope, while their legs were free and they could walk. The other sailors pushed the 3 prisoners up the beach, laughing, yelling, and hitting them. Then some of them sat down on the sand and started to drink. Others walked away to look at the island, and 2 men stayed and watched the boat. The 3 prisoners walked thirdly along the beach and sat down under a tree, not far from us. They looked very upset. Very silently I came up behind them through the trees and called out to them in English. "Don't be afraid," I said. "I'm English. Maybe I can help you." At first they were too surprised to talk. Maybe they thought I was a wild myself. Then the oldest man said, "I'm the captain of the ship, and these 2 men are my first and second officers. Last night there was a mutiny, so the seamen took the ship from me. Now we will be left here to die on this island." "Do they have guns?" "Only 2, and they left the guns on the boat," he replied. I said, "We will help them, yet if we get your ship back for you, you must take me back to England." The captain agreed at once and thanked me very warmly for my help. Friday ran back to my house to bring all the guns, and the captain and I made a plan. As the seamen were not ready for a fight, the first part was easy. We shot the 2 men at the boat, while the captain shot another man. This man, whose name was Tom Smith, was the worst of them all, and he began the mutiny on the ship. Then the captain spoke with the other 5 men, and they agreed to help him. They did not really want to be mutineers, but they were frightened of Tom Smith. "How many men are on the ship?" I asked the captain. 26, he replied. "And they will fight hard, since they won't want to go home. It is that for all rebels in England, but not all of them are bad. I am sure that some of the men will help me." Just after that we saw another boat coming from the ship to the shore. There were 10 men in the ship, and they all had guns. We ran into the trees to wait. It was a long, hard struggle, but by now it was dark and this helped us very much. The seamen could not see us, so they did not know how many people they were fighting. Finally, the first officer shouted to them, "Put down the guns and stop fighting. Our captain has 50 island people who help him. You can all be killed." Thus the seamen stopped fighting, and we took their guns. 3 of them agreed to come back to the captain, and we put the others in my cave. Friday and I stayed to watch the prisoners, as the captain and his men went back to fight for the ship. All night we listened to the sound of guns and shouting, but in the morning, after the sun came up, the captain was the master of his ship again. I went down to the shore and met him. "My dear friend," he exclaimed, "I shall take you to the ends of the world in this ship." I embraced him, and we laughed and cried together. I was so happy to leave the island. My good friend Friday came with me, of course. However, we left the mutineers on the island. We decided not to kill them. They could start a new life on the island. Their life would be easy because of all my hard work for lots of years. And so, on the 19th of December 1686, having spent 27 years, 2 months, and 19 days, I said goodbye to my island and sailed home to England. Chapter 9. Home in England. After I came back to England, I felt like a stranger in the country. Lots of things were different, and not many people remembered me. I went home to York, whereas my mother and father were dead, and also my 2 brothers. I found the 2 sons of my brothers. They were happy to learn that I was alive, and I was happy to find some family. Some months later, I decided to go down to Lisbon in Portugal. I had friends there. They could help me sell my land in Brazil, and I needed money. Friday was still with me. He was always good and loyal friend to me. In Lisbon, I found the Portuguese captain who took me in his ship to Brazil many years ago. It was nice to see him again, and he helped me with my business. Before long, I was ready to go home again by land. It was both long and hard journey. We had to cross the mountains which were between Spain and France, and the snow was deep. Poor Friday was very frightened of the snow. Back in England, I found a house and started to live a quiet life. My nephews came to live with me. The younger one wanted to be a sailor, therefore I found him a place on a ship. And then I married and had 3 children, 2 sons and a daughter. After my wife died, my nephew, who was now the captain of a ship, came home to see me. He knew that I did not really want a quiet life. "I have a good ship, uncle," he said. "I'm sailing to the East Indies, India, Malaya, the Philippines. Come with me." And so, in 1694, I went to sea again, and had a lot of adventures. Maybe one day I will write another book about them.